Peraí, só um pouquinho. Que eu preparei com tanto... Ok. Não, peraí, vê se está certo. Agora está.
Olá! Estamos ao vivo com mais uma sessão de Tutaméia, sempre trazendo para você um convidado muito especial que nos ajuda a entender melhor o Brasil e o mundo. Ela é Eleonora.
Ele é o Rodolfo.
E ele é o Noam, nosso convidado muito especial, Noam Chomsky. Especialíssimo. Que a Eleonora já vai começar a interrogar, a perguntar, mas antes eu quero convidar você para compartilhar os conhecimentos que ele vai trazer para a gente. Então, divulga essa entrevista na sua rede e lembre-se que você pode sempre encontrar essa nossa entrevista no nosso canal de vídeo, o youtube.com/c/Eleonora e Rodolfo Lucena, Tutaméia. Tutaméia escrito com letras maiúsculas, e no nosso site, tutameia.jor.br. Eleonora.
Noam Chomsky, thank you very much for being with us today. It's an honor to receive you here in our home studio here in São Paulo. Noam Chomsky is, I believe, it's the most important intellectual in the world. A philosopher, activist, and I would like to start asking you about your trip to Brazil. The day after tomorrow, we are going to visit President Lula in Curitiba, in prison. And I would like to ask you why you decide to make this visit, and what's your view on the situation about Lula?
Mm-hmm. Well, my wife Valeria and I were invited by actually her friend Celso Amorim to participate in the conference on democracy and multipolarity. The subtext of the conference was the attack on democracy in Brazil, of which the imprisonment of Lula and his exclusion from the election is a prime example. I actually met Lula and spent some time with him back in the late 90s, 20 years ago. Was quite impressed. This is before he was elected. I continued to be impressed by much of what he did while he was in office, along with Amorim. They propelled Brazil to the center of the world stage. It became perhaps the most respected country in the world. There were valuable domestic projects. There were serious flaws, but much achievement, and I have no serious doubt that he should be the next president of Brazil. It would be best for Brazil, best for the world, given the role that Brazil played in the world scene during his period as president. Valeria and I were quite pleased to be invited to the conference and felt this was a good time to both observe firsthand things that are happening in this crucial period, but also to do what we can to support the claims to justice and democracy in Brazil, which is of central significance for, of course, Latin America, but in fact the whole world.
So the seminary came to attend was called Democracy Under Attack. Do you think democracy is under attack today, both in Brazil and in the world?
Well, there is a significant decline of democratic institutions. Their legitimacy is being challenged. Their functioning has declined. This has been, in fact, underway for 40 years. There was a significant change in general socioeconomic policies taking shape in the 1970s, escalated under Reagan and Thatcher. The shift to what are called somewhat misleadingly market-oriented policies, business first policies, which have had a fairly standard effect throughout the world. Differs in different countries, but pretty constant. So for Latin America, it meant 2 lost decades of development under the severe structural adjustment programs. There was then a revival during the last 15, 20 years in several countries, Brazil most prominent among them, which reversed the regression to some extent, but it's now back in force in the West, in the United States, in Europe. This has been very striking. And so just take the United States, the most powerful state in the world by a long shot, but and it's most striking in the United States. So just take a look at the bare facts. Since 1980, real wages have actually declined. So they're less now than they were in 1979. At the same time, salaries, income of corporate executives has escalated by about 1,000%. The policies are designed quite specifically to concentrate wealth, increase corporate power, free financial institutions to change their role in the economy drastically. We should recall that during the first decades after the Second World War, there was a period of, within the state capitalist economies, their greatest growth period in history, and fairly egalitarian growth. So in the United States, the lowest quintile did about as much as the highest quintile. There were also extension of, in Europe, it's called the 30 Glorieuses, great 30 years. And in the United States, it's called the Golden Age of capitalism, actually, state capitalism. This was accompanied by substantial gains in popular rights and in growth of popular activism. By the 60s, late 60s, became quite significant. The large parts of the population were entering the political arena, leaving the state of passivity and docility, which is supposed to be their role. According to standard democratic theory, the general population are supposed to be what are called spectators. They're called the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. They don't belong in the political arena. They're supposed to watch while the responsible people, serious people, run the show. That was challenged in the 1960s, and it was accompanied by militant labor action. So in the late 60s and early 70s, again in the United States, but in Europe, elsewhere too, workers were were engaged in serious strike actions, which were not just aimed at wages and benefits, but also at control of the workplace. That becomes a serious threat to the rulers, to the private rulers of the economy, the people who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, the people who own the economy, closely linked to the state, of course. There was also a decline in the rate of profit, which is considered a very serious threat. So across the spectrum, by the early 70s, you could see a reaction developing, much of it quite public. In fact, it was called even a crisis of democracy, too much democracy. We have to have what was called moderation in democracy. People have to return to their role as passive observers, not try to participate in government. This is from the liberal side. On the right wing, it was much harsher, but it was common across the spectrum. consequence of this whole, there were also serious problems in the organization of the international economic system. The Bretton Woods structure collapsed and so on. So all of this converged into a change of policies in order, from the point of view of the masters of mankind, in order to right the balance so that power shifted back where it's supposed to be, in the hands of private sector closely linked to state power. That's what's happened over the past 40 years. In Europe, it's austerity programs, for which there was no economic justification, were designed quite explicitly to achieve this goal. Actually, there's a fine study of this by an economist, Mark Weisbrot, who writes quite a lot about Brazil and Latin America. But he did an interesting study. In Europe, socioeconomic policies are taken away in the structure of the European Union. They are no longer in the hands of the national states, meaning people don't participate. They're in the hands of the Brussels bureaucracy, the Troika, the European Commission, which is unelected, the IMF, obviously unelected, and the Central Bank. Weisbrot studied every year there are negotiations between the Troika and the individual governments to set policies, and he investigated these and found something very interesting. What he found is that explicitly the policies were designed to reverse the social reforms, the social democratic policies that had developed during the previous period. No economic reasons, just get rid of these policies and return control to the sectors that are, according to the ideology, supposed to rule. So that's Europe, and the United States was the same. We're now seeing quite similar things in Latin America, as in the 80s, in fact. But all of this leads to the great mass of the population is angry, resentful, frightened. One of the major policies has been to create a precarious existence, separate people from one another. That was Margaret Thatcher's famous slogan, "There's no society." As I mentioned the other day, she was actually paraphrasing Marx without knowing it when he condemned the authoritarian rulers of Europe in the mid-19th century for trying to turn society into a sack of potatoes, isolated individuals who had to face concentrated power alone without structure and organization. So, and this is quite explicit. So, for example, when Alan Greenspan, who head of the Federal Reserve, who sort of organized the American economy, he testified to Congress about the achievements of the economy and said straight out they're based on what he called growing worker insecurity. As he pointed out, even when employment is high, very little unemployment, late 90s, he said workers are just too intimidated to ask for benefits and wages, which is very healthy for the economy. If you're an economist, you understand this. It's healthy for the economy because if wages and benefits stay down, there's no threat of inflation. The financial institutions can prosper, and though he didn't mention it, profits can be high, which is what counts. So this is the structure that's developed, and of course it's led to, as wealth concentrates, it automatically affects political power for perfectly obvious reasons. I don't have to go into them, they're too transparent. So you have a decline of democracy, and people are aware of it. They know that they don't have to read academic studies to realize that they're just not represented in the political system. In Europe, it's transparent because the major decisions are up there in the Brussels bureaucracy. In the United States, about 80% of the population in polls for the last 30 years, in fact, have said that the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves. That's the general population, right to left. And it's supported by serious academic studies, which simply compare people's attitudes with the votes of their own representatives, and they're uncorrelated. For the majority of the population, the lower 75, 80%, their own representatives pay no attention to their constituents. They listen to the voices of the donor class because they have to, and has side effects. It means that if you're elected to Congress, first thing you have to do is start amassing support, financial support for the next election, because elections are pretty much bought. You can predict electability just by looking at campaign funding. But what does that mean about legislation? Well, what it means is that the staff of the Congress, congressional representative, meets with corporate lobbyists, big law firms, a lot of power, and they basically write the legislation, literally, and the representative signs it, and it has nothing to do with the attitudes of the population. So you get, of course, a decline of democracy, which is intended and considered good because it's overcoming the crisis of democracy of the 1960s. The crisis was too much political participation. So the decline of democracy is a favorable result. It's returning to the norm. In fact, if you look back at the studies in the early 70s, which are very revealing, the most interesting of them, which people should really read, is a book called The Crisis of Democracy, which is liberal internationalists from Europe, the United States, and Japan, three centers of Western capitalism, and they're very straight and open. They didn't expect anyone to read it. In fact, as soon as it started being read, it was withdrawn from publication. But it's quite an interesting book. This is basically the Carter, in the United States, it's the Carter administration. Carter was a member, and his whole administration was drawn from this. It's that sector of opinion, the kind of center, the liberal center of opinion. And in the discussion, they look back nostalgically to the Truman years, when, as they put it, Truman was able to govern the country with the assistance of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers. And then there was no crisis of democracy, because that's the way it's supposed to be. So we're going back to that, and that's favorable except for the population. So what happens is people are angry, and they're disorganized. The unions have been under severe attack. Thatcher and Reagan, as soon as they came in, their first acts were to try to destroy the unions. Reagan, even for the first time, called in scabs, which is illegal in just about every country. And of course, he did manage to break the union, the public union that he was attacking with scabs, and then it was quickly picked up by private corporations who did the same thing. Won't go through the details, but there are a lot of moves have been made under Clinton as well to undermine unions. So people are left alone. It is a sack of potatoes, and they react in very antisocial ways.
Só antes da Eleonora fazer a pergunta dela, antes disso, só queria lembrar que, apesar da entrevista estar sendo feita em inglês, todo mundo está percebendo, mas a gente tem dois colaboradores, a tradutora e professora de inglês Rê Gabriele, que está nos comentários fazendo traduções, e a jornalista e também tradutora Leda Beck, que também está colaborando com a gente aí nos comentários. A gente agradece a participação delas. Eleonora?
Mr. Chomsky, in the beginning you said that we are here in Brazil in a very crucial moment, very special moment. You talk about democracy now, we are talking about elections. We have an election in just a few days. Some say that Brazil was a victim of a coup that was planned, or there is U.S. interest in this coup, because Brazil is a very resourceful country, a colossus, has Petrobras. It's a very rich country, and it's known, as you said some days ago, that with Amorim, Brazil has become a very important player in the international scene in order to escape from the influence of the United States. Do you believe that we are having here a United States coup in Brazil? What we're living? Why we are in this so called crucial moment?
Well, first of all, it's absolutely true that during the early part of this decade, this century, up till a couple of years ago, Brazil was in the lead in creating what could have been an independent South. Yeah. Now, that had been attempted before, of course, back in the 1960s. The UNCTAD, was leading a new international economic order, and a new information order. There were the Brazilian economists were in the lead in this, in fact, and that was considered a very serious threat. It was beaten back very strikingly with across the board in the West. All of that was attacked. Very striking. The new international economic order was just immediately beaten down. None of the powerful wanted to permit any of that. It would have been a developmental system for the South to become, to escape from its backwardness and use the immense potential that it has to become a leading part in the world system. But that was intolerable. Very striking was the reaction to the proposal for the new international information order. This was in the 1970s, early 80s. The countries of the South, in which Brazil had a leading role at the time, were trying to break through the near monopoly on information by the main Western mega corporations that control the international economic system. And this was portrayed in the West as an attack on freedom. Because it was going to limit the power of the concentrated monopolies to control everything. There's a concept called libertarianism, which is the most reactionary thing imaginable. What it amounts to is private power should rule everything. It's called libertarianism, because then people make free contracts. Like if you're starving, you'll be willing to take a job for 10 cents an hour. That's a free contract, so that's liberty. And the information order meant that the few concentrated kind of the oligopoly that fundamentally controls international information shouldn't be challenged. So it was a huge attack. In fact, UNESCO, which was the scene in which this was being enacted, was bitterly attacked. The U.S., in fact, withdrew from it and stopped supporting it under the concept of attack on freedom. This was across the board. The liberal press took the same position. We cannot permit a challenge to the oligopoly of information control, and that was beaten down. Then comes the neoliberal period, Reagan and Thatcher up to the present, which aims to restore the traditional system in which, as they put it, the liberals put it, Truman was able to govern the country with the help of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers, no problems. They were quite. People should really read that. They talked about, this is the liberals I'm talking about. The right wing was much harsher. The liberals are always more interesting because they set the kind of limits on discussion. You can go this far and not a millimeter farther. We're the outside limits. They were concerned with what they called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. That's the universities, the schools. They're not indoctrinating the young properly, and they have to be made harsher, more disciplined. It's the beginning of the period when you start getting a very sharp rise in tuitions, so that students are burdened. If maybe somebody goes to law school and wants to be a public interest lawyer, but you come out of law school with a couple $100,000 in debt, and you're just compelled to work for a corporate law firm to survive. And once you're inside that system, you become integrated into it, and your original ideals decline, and you're out to make money for the corporations. It's a disciplinary system, so there's better indoctrination of the young. And a business model has been imposed on the universities. In the United States, for example, public funding of colleges and universities has very sharply declined, which means that they basically survive on corporate funding, high tuitions, and so on. All of this is restoring proper indoctrination of the young. Across the board, we have to understand that class warfare is taken very seriously by the rulers. They're basically Marxists with the values inverted. The values are inverted, but they understand very well. And this is very sharp in Brazil, where class hatred is extreme. I've got to learn more about this, what I've learned from Valeria, my wife, but it's pretty amazing to see. It's bad enough in the United States, but it's much more extreme here. I think so. And just plain hatred. The idea that somebody like Lula, who didn't go to college and doesn't speak Portuguese properly, should be allowed to speak in public is just totally unacceptable. How can we tolerate this? Those people are supposed to be the servants, not the rulers. Going back to what you call the coup, I think that's a large part of the basis for it. Brazil is highly inegalitarian. Traditionally, there's a very small sector of highly concentrated wealth and enormous poverty, and as you said, it's a country with very rich resources. This should be one of the richest countries in the world. Colombia is the same. In fact, you go back a couple centuries, the Caribbean was the center of wealth for the world. In fact, it's the source of Europe's wealth. They were draining resources from the Caribbean. In fact, if you look more closely, it's quite remarkable. Go back to the beginnings of British and French and Dutch imperialism, 17th century. The richest parts of the world were Bangladesh and Haiti, countries which are now the symbols of total unbelievable poverty. Haiti was the richest colony anywhere. About 20% of France's wealth comes from just exploiting Haitian wealth. When the British got to Bengal, it's now Bangladesh, they couldn't believe the wealth and opulence and advance of how advanced the civilizations were. In fact, China and India were the commercial and industrial centers of the world, and the Western Hemisphere had enormous wealth. Well, imperialism took care of that. It's inverted things. Going to Brazil, but it also instilled in the elites of the colonies the same conceptions, sharply and harshly. So if you compare, say, Latin America with East Asia in the last 50 years, say, if an observer from outside would have predicted that Latin America would grow and develop and East Asia would be backwards. Here's where Latin America is where the resources are, the lively population, rich culture, and so on. It's the opposite. And if you look closely, you can see why. East Asia, you take a look at imports in East Asia, capital goods. targeted investment. East Asia, say South Korea, Taiwan, accepted investment, but they targeted it for their own developmental programs. There's no capital flight. The rich are under control. They pay taxes. They're under control. In South Korea, during its developmental years, you could get the death penalty for capital flight. Compare it to Latin America. The rich spend their money in houses in the Riviera, don't pay taxes, send their children to fancy colleges, and they have no responsibility for the country. Imports are luxury goods, not capital goods. There's no targeted investment. You sell off your own. What's developed, you sell to somebody else. So in fact, it ought to be what was once expected, the so-called Colossus of the South. Instead, it just doesn't develop. It began to, during what's called the pink tide, the early years of this century. It was not, Brazil, as I say, was in the lead in organizing the voice of the South, picking up from the failures of the 60s and the 70s, which were beaten down. But it went well beyond that. There were institutions that began to develop, like UNASUR or CELAC, or the BRICS, which began to move towards independence. And that was a shocking development for the United States. For the United States, Latin America has always been called, as the Secretary of War put it under Roosevelt, our little region over here, which doesn't bother anybody. We control it. And now the United States was virtually being expelled from the hemisphere. If you look at the hemispheric conferences in Cartagena, Panama, 2010 to 2012, the United States and Canada were isolated. The conferences could not reach the usual consensus agreement because the U.S. and Canada wouldn't agree. The main issues were first admitting Cuba into the hemisphere, which all the countries wanted, but the U.S. refused. And the other, strikingly, was the drug war. The victims of the drug war are Latin America. The source of the drug war is the United States, both the demand for drugs and the supply. So if you look at the arms, the confiscated arms in Mexico, large majority come from the United States. Where I live in Arizona, you can walk into a store and walk out with 5 assault rifles, which you can then give to the guy from the Mexican cartel who happily takes them across the border. So the supply of arms and the demand for drugs is in the United States, and it's Latin America that suffers in all sorts of ways. So the countries of Latin America, right to left, including the right-wing, president of Guatemala, want to just move to the sensible position of decriminalizing drugs. The United States will not accept that. Has to be criminalized for many reasons. For one reason, because in the United States it essentially restores something which is very crucial for the United States, slavery. The country was built on slavery. In the post-Civil War period, a form of slavery was restored, incarceration, which led to a slave labor force. We're now back to that under the drug war. The large majority since Reagan, the number of people in prison has just skyrocketed. Back in the early 80s in the United States, incarceration rates were roughly at the level of Europe, a little higher, but within the spectrum. Now they're 5 to 10 times as high, mostly blacks, black males, Hispanic males. And a very high percentage are things like victimless crimes, somebody found with too much marijuana or something, put into jail, can't pay their way out, they stay there for years. This whole combination of, and in fact, if you look at the 2016 election, a large factor in it was simply white supremacy. Obama was hated. The idea that black man could be in the White House was like a person who can't speak Portuguese properly being president of Brazil. That's just not tolerable. In fact, about probably 25% of Republicans literally think that Obama's Antichrist. It's a very religious country, remember, very religious. And but this was just, I mean, his election, he didn't do very much. He was, in fact, a business-oriented political figure who internationally was carrying out terrorist action, the drone program, but it didn't matter. He's the wrong type of person. We can't have him there. And one of the central policy commitments of the Republicans is to undo anything that Obama did. Doesn't matter what, because this was just intolerable. And you're seeing the same in Brazil. It's very similar when Temer says, okay, let's destroy the country because of we have to undo everything that was done. So no investment, nothing for education, and anything that was done by the progressive government, we just undo. It's pretty similar in the United States if you look at it. So going back to the question of the coup, I don't think the United States organized it. It no longer has that kind of power. It's not the early 1960s when the U.S. could actually prepare the coup of 64 and then strongly support it when it took place, the U.S., and then throughout the whole hemisphere. It wasn't just Brazil. But that's no longer possible. The U.S. it's very powerful, but nothing like the earlier years. So it can be supportive of what was a kind of soft coup in Brazil, but I don't think you can say that it implemented it. Not that it wouldn't have liked to, but it just doesn't have that power anymore. And I think these are largely internal Brazilian problems, which are extremely serious. They go way back. The source of the inequality, the lack of development, the failure of, there were periods of developmental programs under Vargas and others, but didn't really stick.
So even though the coup, the result of the coup benefits the United States, the U.S. companies are, for instance, in the oil sector are
not as much as it used to, because now there's a competitor. China, which has higher trade with Latin America than the United States does. In the early post-war period, there were no competitors. The United States ran the show. Now Latin America's somewhat more independent, and there's an independent economic force in the world. Nothing compare with the United States, but it's significant. And for Brazil and Latin America, it was very important. It absorbed, it was in fact harmful for Latin America because it kind of induced policymakers to turn to the easy choice of exporting primary resources and importing cheap manufacturers, which undermines the economy. It sort of works for a while, but it's not going to be a way to develop. The same thing happened in Venezuela, the end of the Chavez years, which showed lots of progress, but Venezuela was still about 95% dependent on oil exports. You cannot develop an economy that way. And Venezuela, like Brazil, could be a rich, flourishing economy. It has agricultural resources, could be a manufacturing center. Instead, it just exported oil and exported capital, enormous export of capital, plenty of corruption, which all goes along with that kind of model.
And you said, what was your vision on the election? What do you see? You are in Brazil now for some days. What do you see the election process? It will be fair.
Well,
it will be. You think that the military could intervene? Some people were saying that if PT wins the election, could be another kind of coup. Do you believe that it's possible?
think it's possible, but what looks likely at this point, just judging by the polls, is that with Lula barred from participation, Bolsonaro or maybe somebody else who they'll put in his place at the last minute. I mean, I don't know what thinking is going on inside his party, but it's conceivable that they're just holding on to him in the hospital till the last minute, and then somebody will be put forth to try to take, to exploit his unfortunate popularity. But they'll presumably get the plurality of the votes. Then comes the second round, and if the optimal situation, I don't know if it'll happen, will be if the other parties, like Ciro Gomez, Haddad, unite somehow in the second round and try to prevent Bolsonaro victory, which I think would be very dangerous for Brazil. But whether that'll happen or not, I don't know.
But do you think the election could be a way out of the coup? I mean, to get Brazil back in track?
Well, the election wouldn't be enough. It could stave off the worst. In fact, that's the most that we can hope for at this point, I think. Then come facing the real problems. What is it that has prevented Brazilian growth and development over the years? And there are deep problems there. The class hatred, the sharp inequality, the lack of programs for serious programs of development, the focus on export of primary products and import of cheap manufacturers. All of these things have to be reversed. So those are serious internal problems. There were steps towards it, but not sufficient. And it's true that outside forces like the United States will be supporting programs that I think we agree are harmful for Brazil, but that doesn't overcome the fact that it can be and must be not changed from within. That began to happen during the early years of the century, and it's been aborted for now, but has to be picked up and go on, which I think is possible. The resources, human and material, are there.
So Brazil can rise again?
Can again. After all, the recent past gives an indication of what can be achieved.
Yeah, yesterday you used the word colossus that Brazil had in the first years of this century under Lula government.
It began.
Started to go to the path of being a colossus.
And then you get a reaction from the powerful. That's,
But can it regain this position?
Yes, I think so. As I say, the resources, both human and material, are still there. In fact, they've been there for a century. It's a matter of picking up, facing the challenge and overcoming it, which is not impossible. There's been plenty of achievements over the past years, many. It's a much more civilized world than it used to be, and that's not gifts from above. That's constant popular struggle. It goes on all the time.
Yesterday you mentioned a poll that was made about Gallup, I believe, so asking people once who was the worst for democracy, the major enemy of democracy.
That's a very interesting story.
And I would add to that a question that Laura had asked to ask you about a very broad question about the future of capitalism.
General future of capitalism. Well, first of all, that we should bear in mind that capitalism is a bit of a myth. We don't really have capitalist societies. We have state capitalist societies, and the state has always played an essential, central role in development and extension of the capitalist system. So that goes back to England in the 17th century and all the way through the history of development. But let's just take the recent period. So take today's high-tech economy. Take, say, your iPhone. If you take your iPhone and you take the technology in it and take it apart, turns out that almost everything comes from the state sector. The GPS was developed by the Navy, the electronics was developed in military labs, everything. The computer that's in front of you. The computers began to be developed in the 1950s, actually in large part in the lab where I happened to be working. It wasn't until 1977 that Apple was able to produce a computer that could be marketed for profit. That's after about 30 years of research and development in the state sector. Now, suppose we had capitalist societies. One of the principles of capitalism is supposed to be that if you invest in something, especially if you invest to make a risky, costly investment over, say, 30 years, and there's some profit that comes out, it's supposed to go back to you, but our system doesn't work like that. It goes to Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. The public pays the costs through various devices, university labs and so on, and then after many years, something is handed over to private corporations and they make the profit. Same with the internet. The beginnings of the internet were in the late 1950s, actually in the same lab where I was working at MIT. That began thinking about the internet, and it developed over decades within the government system, meaning taxpayer support. Finally, in around 1995, the public made a gift, simply a gift, to private corporations to say, okay, you guys can have the internet that we developed. Now we have the half a dozen huge mega corporations which run the internet. It's a public gift, And in fact, across the board, that's the way it is. It'd be the same if you go back to the 19th century, when what was called the American system of production developed, kind of amazed the world, mass production, quality control, interchangeable parts. Most of it was developed in government armories. That's where you can do experimentation. You can make investments for the long term. Private corporations don't do that. They want to make profit tomorrow, not invest for what might happen in 30 years, And that's, in fact, the entire history of development of what we call capitalism and its current function. If you look at the present, take the people who are saying we have to have a small government and devote ourselves to the market, and just look at how they live. There are huge public subsidies, government subsidies, to every major sector of the economy, agribusiness, energy, finance. They're all heavily publicly subsidized. But that's okay. That's a proper function of the government, just not pensions and security and health and irrelevant things like that. So that's what's called capitalism, but it's a very specific, specifically shaped and designed form of capitalism. So can that survive? Well, it certainly shouldn't survive. And I think that can be changed. In fact, the public wants it to be changed. So again, if you take a look, the United States is a very heavily polled society, mainly because business wants to know what people think. That's important. So we know a lot about people's attitudes. One thing we know is that across the spectrum, people want much higher taxes on the rich. The taxes keep going down. In fact, those results usually aren't even reported. That even people who, are considered very right-wing, Tea Party, let's say, if you take a look at their actual attitudes, they're more or less social democratic. People say, yeah, we want a very small government, but we want more expenditures in health and education and support for people who can't feed their children and so on, but just small government, but all the things that a big government does. In fact, even attitudes on things like foreign aid are very interesting. Like in the polls about foreign aid, everyone says it's way too high. We're giving everything away to the undeserving foreigners. And when you ask them what foreign aid should be, this is about 10 times as high as it actually is, because these are the results of extensive propaganda systems which indoctrinate people into having certain conceptions. Everybody's stealing from us, the poor are taken away, the government's putting the poor in front of us, immigrants are flooding the country. Take, say, immigration. A huge concern about immigration in the United States, Mexican rapists and criminals. Almost half the immigration is from Asia. Educated, trained people who are being brought in to help develop the high-tech economy. It's about 40% of the immigrants. It's not what people are hear,
Yeah.
What they hear is something that doesn't exist, Mexican criminals. But it's pretty much the same in Europe. So, for example, in fact, it's very striking. I mentioned the other day the latest elections in Europe were in Sweden a couple of weeks ago, which again, the right wing did get a much higher percentage than everyone wanted, which is a frightening development. But there was a careful study of the rise of the right in Sweden, and what it showed was very interesting and generalizes. Turns out that the rise of the right in Sweden was before the wave of immigrants. It was a reaction of people who were basically cast aside by the abandonment of the social democratic policies as the government, including the social democratic so-called left, began to move towards so-called austerity programs. People, the mass of the population is left out. Some people do fine. They get rich, the elites, as they're called. So what most of the people see is, well, those guys up there are doing fine and I'm left out. So I object, and I'm going to respond by voting for the nationalist, xenophobic party. That was before the wave of immigrants. Once the immigrants come in, they serve as a convenient scapegoat. And say, oh, it's their fault. It's not the fault of the corporations up there. We don't see them. In Finland, where the same study showed, there's the same rise in the right-wing parties, but almost no immigration. If you take a look at the United States, it's quite interesting. In the 2016 election, there have been extensive studies of why people voted for Trump. And almost all the studies say it's racism and sexism, which is not false, but the question is, why did these attitudes emerge? And if you look back, they emerge from people who were left out, who have been stagnating for 40 years, even worse, wages declining, benefits declining, organization declining. Those are communities that are ripe for a demagogue who can blame everything on a scapegoat. Racism is there, undoubtedly. Misogyny is there. Xenophobia is there. And it comes out of the bottle when people are angry and resentful and don't know where to turn for explanation for their plight. I think the source of a lot of this is simply the neoliberal policies of the last generation, which were designed. They're not a law of nature, They're designed to have certain consequences, which they have. And one of them is leaving the mass of the population as what's sometimes called a precariat. People living precarious existences, no security, pensions aren't coming, no organization, we're a sack of potatoes. We're going to look for somebody responsible. And the easiest place to look is people who are even more vulnerable than you are. And so it shows up in these dangerous antisocial attitudes. The decline of democracy is a consequence, and in fact a desired consequence of the policies that were instituted. They overcome what was called the crisis of democracy, too much democracy. So now, yes, we've succeeded in reducing the crisis of democracy, with the consequences that follow from that.
So,
What about the other poll that you talked about yesterday? The one that in the States they asked about what would be the worst enemy of peace in the world?
Democracy.
Oh, that.
Democracy.
Well, that's two different questions, not unrelated.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the greatest threat to democracy is simply neoliberal programs, which have the consequence of concentrating power in private corporate hands, which automatically leads to a decline of democracy. And we must bear in mind that that was what was intended by the liberal sectors, who were concerned about the crisis of democracy when the militancy and activism of the 60s were just engaging too many people in the political system. So the decline of democracy is not a failure, it's a success. Now, if you ask about the threat of world peace, there comes this very interesting poll I mentioned last night. The major polling agency, the U.S.-based Gallup Corporation, that does studies of international opinion every year. They ask all sorts of questions, lots of information. 1 year, 2013, this is under Obama, incidentally, and not Trump, under Obama, during the period when 2013 Obama was still regarded as some sort of great hope for peace, for the first time they asked the question, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? And the answer was so startling that it was never published in the United States, never reported. The answer, and Gallup never asked the question again, incidentally. The answer was, well, the United States by a large margin. There was way behind the United States. In second place was Pakistan with much lower support, and that's misleading because there's a big Indian vote. They probably all regarded Pakistan at the top. So it's basically the United States. If you ask in the United States, there's an answer. Iran, North Korea, those are the threats. But in international opinion, they're not even barely mentioned, hardly even mentioned. In fact, Iran is mentioned by a low percentage, the same percentage as Israel, approximately. But basically, it's the United States which is the threat. So there's a threat to world peace. The world understands it. The United States it's unthinkable. You know, I mean, not only you can't say it, you can't even think it. It's so outlandish. Actually, it's quite interesting. There was one newspaper in the United States that did report this poll. It's a Murdoch tabloid, a right-wing Murdoch tabloid, the New York Post, and the way they reported it was to say, "Look how crazy the world is." You know, that's but these and this is not the right wing, I should stress. This is mainstream, liberal, educated, intellectual sectors, just like the Crisis of Democracy book was. So.
And how about resistance? You said the system will not survive like this. Can't
it's
survive.
Impossible for a reason we haven't discussed.
Wow.
There are two huge crises growing. One of them we know about, the nuclear threat. If you look at the history of the nuclear age, it's an absolute miracle that we've survived. If there was time, we could go through it, but case after case, dozens of times, sometimes by accident, mostly by accident, sometimes by reckless acts of leaders. We came literally within minutes of terminal destruction, literally. Some of the cases are shocking when you look at them, and miracles don't continue. So sooner or later, we'll manage to destroy ourselves. The other is global warming, which is very serious. I mean, if the use of fossil fuels continues at anything remotely like the present level, by the end of this century, let's say, we might see sea level rising 6 to 10 meters. You know, you can just imagine what that would mean. plus what we already see, severe weather, droughts, hurricanes, typhoons, all escalating. And it already has big effects, like the Syrian war, for example. One of its roots is a unprecedented drought, nothing in hundreds of thousands of years of history, huge drought, surely the result of global warming, which drove peasants off the land into the cities, no way for them to survive. It creates a kind of kindling which any spark will set off. So it's part of the background for the conflicts that arose. The same happened in Darfur. The huge drought drove nomads into the agricultural areas. And there's also ethnic conflict there that immediately led to conflict and confrontation, ended up with big massacres. These things are not just future. We're living with the beginnings of them. You take a look at Bangladesh, which is mostly a coastal plain. The sea level starts rising. What's going to happen to hundreds of millions of people? If the glaciers keep melting in the Himalayas, the already meager water supply in South Asia is going to be severely threatened. I mean, right now there are several 100 million people in India who do not have potable water. And Pakistan, it's going to be even worse. I mean, we're talking about the fate of hundreds of millions of people in the near future. The rich may think they can escape by going to a mountain somewhere, but that's not going to happen. And the policies that are being pursued are to escalate the problem. It's not just Trump. Take the big banks. You take a look at the J.P. Morgan Chase, huge banks. They know exactly what the consequences are, and they're increasing their investments in fossil fuels. That's the nature of capitalism. Capitalism, as I said, we have a mixed form of capitalism, but there is a market system underlying it somewhere. And an imperative of the market system is that you try to make maximal profit tomorrow, and you disregard what are called externalities, the things that are not charged on. And if you don't do that, you're out of the game. It's part of the structure of the system. So Jamie Dimon, who's a smart guy, head of J.P. Morgan Chase, understands perfectly well the consequences, but nevertheless is compelled by the logic of the institutions to maximize the threat to his own grandchildren. He may not like it. Maybe on the side he gives money to the Sierra Club, environmental groups, but as functioning within the system, they're destroying the possibility for organized life. That is nothing that you can put Band-Aids on. This is much deeper. And of course, the Trump administration, has just, by far, we ought to have big headlines in the newspapers every day saying these guys are trying to destroy the possibility of organized human life. And if you think about it honestly, there's been nothing in all of human history to compare with this. Not Attila the Hun, not Genghis Khan, not Hitler. Horrible as they were, they never tried to destroy organized human life. This is something new. There's no word to describe it. Evil doesn't capture it. It's insanity doesn't capture it because it's not insane. It's planned and conscious and part of the very logic of the system in which they work. Now, of course, with Trump and his associates, they're trying to extend it, make it worse. That's not part of the logic of the system. The system could function with, palliative efforts as Obama, in fact, was doing, and most of the world is doing. Not enough, but at least something. But it's a very deep problem. It's like class hatred in Brazil. This is deep. You can't put a Band-Aid on it. It's fundamental things that have to be dealt with.
And how about the resistance?
Yeah.
How about resistance? Resistance, the movements against capitalism, against those things. Do you believe that it's going to
That's the encouraging part of the story.
Yeah.
All over the world, there is resistance, and it's significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the most popular political figure in the United States by a considerable margin is Bernie Sanders, which is kind of unthinkable in the framework of American political history. It's never happened in American political history that somebody like Sanders could become even noticed, let alone become the most popular political figure in the country. Now just think of what happened. Here's a guy, you have to recognize that American elections are literally bought. You can predict the outcome of elections with remarkable precision simply by looking at campaign funding, executive and Congress. It goes back well over 100 years. Here's somebody who entered the campaign virtually unknown, no media support, barely mentioned. If the media mentioned him, they just made fun of him, no support, zero from any of the funders, no corporate support, no support from private wealth. He even used what's in the United States a kind of four-letter word. The United States is, I suppose, the only country in the world, outside of maybe some dictatorship, where you can't say the word socialism, no, let alone communism. But it's just unspeakable. It's literally a four-letter word.
It's a legacy of martyrism.
Yeah, and he said he was a socialist. Socialist really means New Deal Democrat. Doesn't mean anything very profound.
Okay.
But with all of that, he came very close to winning the nomination for the Democrats.
You are for Hillary at that time.
Pardon?
You are for Hillary at that time.
No.
No?
Not in the after the nomination, yes, but that's not for Hillary. That's against Trump.
Okay.
That's something quite different. She was awful. But if Sanders had been able to win the nomination, frankly, I don't know what would have happened, because the Republican propaganda machine, which had not been directed against Sanders, and which is huge, corporate-backed, fantastic, it would be directed against Sanders. And what you'd start hearing is things about this atheist Jew, communist, wants to destroy everything, a ton of stuff like that. He probably couldn't have withstood it. So it's kind of unpredictable, but that's what certainly would have happened. How people would react to that, you really don't know. It's hard to, you can see it in England right now, the attack on Corbyn. And there's enormous fear, including the Labour Party, the old Labour Party, the Guardian, the idea that you might have a political party that actually represents the general public and its interests and suffering people abroad and is led by a decent human being. That's totally intolerable. So you have this enormous attack of the kind that you can't defend yourself against, like anti-Semitism. As soon as you say somebody's a Holocaust denier or an anti-Semite, there's no defense, basically. And it's just across the board, a huge attack on Corbyn and the Labour Party. And that's the kind of thing you would have seen if Sanders had come in. They'd pick it a little differently, but anti-Israel, all this huge propaganda, which is so familiar, you can just make it up. But so there's a lot to overcome. But what the Sanders campaign showed and what the Corbyn success shows is that you can do quite a lot. These Sanders and Yanis Varoufakis just came out with a joint declaration. Varoufakis,
what do you think about this?
That's very important, I think. Varoufakis is a very smart, interesting guy. They have He's the center of this new political organization, DiEM25, which is in fact running candidates, transnational candidates for the European Parliament and ultimately in the Greek elections and later other ones, which is a kind of a counterpart to Corbyn and Sanders. And the Varoufakis-Sanders declaration a couple of days ago is, it's not radical. It's calling for sensible, multipolar, liberal democratic structures. It wants to, in Europe, to preserve what's good about the European Union and to overcome the serious flaws, same in the Western Hemisphere. Things like the Obrador election in Mexico are another example. So I think if you look around the world, and the just plain level of activism, mainly among young people, is quite surprising, striking. I think it's much higher than almost ever been, except for few brief moments, like 1968, there's a brief spike. But this is lasting. So I think the basis is sort of there if it can be brought together and organized.
Yeah, talking about hope, we interviewed Zapatero and Máximo D'Alema, and they said that if a progressive candidate is elected in Brazil, Brazil and Mexico can make like an axis that may change the balance of power even in the world.
Yeah, that's pretty close to what was happening 10 years ago with the rise of UNASUR, BRICS, and particularly CELAC, which never really got off the ground, but that was a very important organization because it excluded the United States and Canada. It's the first time in the history of the hemisphere that an organization was created just for the countries other than the Colossus of the North, was kept out. And it was showing up in the discussions at the hemispheric meetings. There was a real basis for it. And then you get this very sharp reaction to beat it back. So now UNASUR barely functions, but the background is there. Could be picked up again.
Can build a kind of international, not international communist anymore, but an international progressive movement.
That's what's needed, and that's what the Sanders-Varoufakis call was calling for. And I think there's a basis, but these things don't happen by themselves. It takes energy and dedication, commitment, just like anything else. Getting rid of abolitionism was fought for hundreds of years before you could finally get formal ending of slavery. Women's rights goes back hundreds of years. These things are not easy to achieve.
And your message to Brazil, your final message.
Message? I don't feel.
What are you going to say about Lula? With Lula?
When you meet Lula, what are you going to tell him? What are you going to say?
Well, I'm going to talk about how much I enjoyed spending time with him 20 years ago and how I think he ought to be the next president of Brazil and how completely outrageous these judicial decisions are. In fact, just take a look at it. I mean, even if every charge against Lula was correct, which is very questionable, but just let's say they're all correct. So he was given an apartment which he never lived in and so on. Okay, 12 years in jail for that? That's a coup, It's such a gross miscarriage of justice. I mean, by any standard, certainly by Brazilian standards. I mean, how many apartments does Cardozo have around the world, for example? But by any standards, this is a radical miscarriage of justice, even if you accept the validity of the charges, which raises many questions in themselves. But so that's. I think this is obvious. It doesn't take any deep understanding to reach these conclusions.
So what Brazilian people should do about it?
Well, it's in their hands to overcome it. It can be done. I mean, they're not trapped,
They're not trapped.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you want to say something more.
No?
Thank you very much. A gente agradece muito aqui a presença do Noam Chomsky aqui nos nossos estúdios domésticos aqui do TUTAMÉIA. Lembramos que toda essa entrevista fica disponível para você assistir novamente, ver, rever, discutir com os amigos no nosso canal de vídeo. Basta digitar TUTAMÉIA na internet que vai chegar lá, mas o endereço é youtube.com/c/Eleonora e Rodolfo Lucena, TUTAMÉIA, o TUTAMÉIA escrito com letras maiúsculas, e tudo isso fica também no nosso site, tutameia.jor.br. Queríamos agradecer também a participação nessa entrevista, nos comentários, traduzindo na hora ali, em tempo real, da jornalista e tradutora Leda Beck e da professora e tradutora de inglês, a Renata Gabriele, que colaboraram conosco, para que essa entrevista possa ser compreendida e chegar mais longe aí, que é o nosso objetivo. E com isso a gente vai se encaminhando para o nosso bordão de encerramento, né?
A gente encerra, como sempre, com o contrapoema do Augusto de Campos, contrapoema que eu vou botar na telinha agora, Lula livre.
Lula livre.